the boys seemed to be getting interested in girls, but I was more interested in the boys, and particularly when we played football. I loved the idea of tackling them and them jumping on top of all that. So, and in the black church, it was an abomination that man lie down with man. So that became confusing to me because I hadn't done any of that. I felt like I wanted to, but I hadn't done it. But an abomination became like a source of confusion, as was the ideal of why someone will hate me simply because of my color. So those aspects of my life in the terms of how seeing color-only signs and going to the back door of places and never at the front door, and certainly not allowed to sit at the counter, and knowing this feeling that I had was very negatively impacted me, and I didn't know who to go to or who to talk with, and I had no one to talk with about it. Interestingly enough, I remember talking with my sisters and some of my cousins about how cute the captain of the basketball team was, and they thought that, I mean, none of them told me that, hey, you better not be talking that way. I mean, we had a great time talking about it. You know, we were gossiping and all of that. But I learned that being a scholar, I was the top of my class in school. And then I became an athlete. So I was what you might call a scholar athlete. And that was a way of trying to become the man instead of these feelings that I had, which was more like wanting to be the woman. At 17, I moved to Newark, and the first thing that struck me about Newark, more than anything else, was that Newark was more segregated in many ways than I felt I was in the South, and that became another source of contradiction. Like, why would I come to this city hoping to be in a more positive place for myself as a person of color, as a black person? At that time, we were colored people. And finding that, no, that didn't exist. You could see the line starts, Central Ward, South Ward, to Bloomfield Avenue, and then you get, as you go across, you become black, and then Hispanic, and then white. And that was sort of how the city was divided. And I learned early on that most American cities are that way. Almost all of our cities are that way. At 17, I had never experienced and did not experience actually having a relationship with a man until I went to the military. And doing R&R, I was drafted into the military. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I served 2 years in the military, 1 year in Vietnam. And I met a man who happened to be married, but we became friends. And I guess you might say my first date was a R&R to Tokyo, Japan, when we became intimate. Never in the combat zone, but only on R&R.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nataly Masisonet Evans. And why do I remember? I remember too many things for too long. And probably what I need to do is to break it, because the teenager years that it was for many of them, it was different for me. The first thing that I remember is that when at the age of 5, I told my godmother that when does my girlfriend is going to give me a wedding ring. And she said, girlfriend doesn't give boys a wedding ring. And that has never moved out of my head. But then I started to notice that I was attracted to the boys. The boys were always looking for me. The boys always wanted to play with me. And everything was physical. And at that time, I couldn't understand, and I believe probably at the age of 6, I was sexually abused for the first time, not knowing exactly what it was. And then Nataly had the personality that Nataly had all her years. As a matter of fact, if I think that the person who Nataly was at the age of 5 is the same person that Nataly is at 57. Then what happened was that Nataly developed the personality that she has. And the personality that she has is what she has. It was nothing to change because that's the personality that I have. Growing up in Puerto Rico, you are different, but who cares if I'm different? I'm me. So they call you pato, which is pato means that you are gay, I think, a faggot or something like that. So who cares what people think, because this is me. So when I really realized that I was a different person, that was the person that I was born, I said, so what? It's like it never occurred to me that it was a big issue because Nataly was Nataly. And people need to respect Nataly as who Nataly was. Then at the age of 17, I decided to come to this country. When I decided to come to this country, I wanted to have a different life, which I didn't know what kind of life it was going to be. So I wanted to come to this country. So when I come to this country and I realized the life that I wanted to live, that's when I became to be a child. Until the age of 17, I was something. After the age of 17, when I realized that my goal was to become a woman, then I became a girl. And when you're 17 and you're a girl, you do a lot of crazy things because you're acting like you're a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old at the age of 17. But that was fine. That was okay for me, even if I have to walk around with flip-flop and pantyhose. Because I wanted to wear pantyhose even if we were with flip-flops. But one of the things that one time somebody says to me, do you know that and I was working in a hangar company, even that I had finished my first year of college. So I decided they said, if you move to Hartford, Connecticut, and I was living in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. In Hartford, Connecticut, there is a program from transgenders. I don't know what that meant. They will give you hormones. They will give you counseling. They will say, well, I pick up all my stuff in a Greyhound bus, and here I go. I moved to Hartford, Connecticut, but I don't know where I was going. I know I was after something, but I don't know what that after was. I go there, and for the first time, decide to see a lot of other women like me. Because you see gay people, you see patos, you see a lot of things, but I don't see me. You see, I never prostituted. I never was into drugs. I never wanted to be a show in front of everybody and dancing, which I adored to see, but I couldn't see myself doing that. So I go to Hartford. I have to be in welfare, because for you to be in welfare, you will be able to get all these things that the government was giving you. The visits to the psychologist, to the psychiatrist. You will get the Medicaid to get you hormones. And everybody wanted to have titties. I wanted to have titties. So I go there, and I begin the process that I don't know where it was going to take me to. I decided to enter into a relationship that, of course, it was not a good relationship. I decided to be with this Puerto Rican guy who used to beat me up all the time because he didn't want me to work, because he needed to support me, like every woman goes through. Many of us, I should say. So in Connecticut, I spent about 5 years going to psychiatrists and psychologists and so on and on and on, until one day the social worker says, you have to go back to school. We're not going to pay you for no more of that stuff. I said, okay. So here I am with my nice dress and my heels, go to the so-called manpower program. And here I go to the manpower program with about another 100 people that at that time was trying to learn English to do whatever they have to do. So here Nataly goes. 2 weeks after I was in that program, a counselor said, I have to take you out for a job, hunting. I said, me, job hunting? There is people here for 6, 7 months, why me? She said, I promise you, you're gonna get a job because you have skills. They took me to the School of Medicine at the Yukon Health Center in Farmington. And do you know that I was hired on the spot? That's when my whole life changed. I became a secretary that hardly speak any English. And I was trained by the greatest person that Dr. Ray Ellen, PhD, is. And this person taught me to be political, taught me how to speak English, and taught me how to behave in all kinds of environments. And among all of those things, one day, I learned that the Aetna Health Insurance will pay for my surgery, pay because I was a state employee. In 1981, I became the woman that I am today at the age of 27. That's when the woman began. That's when my life started. So even that I'm 57 years of age, in my life, I'm 30. Because my life started the day when I became a woman. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can listen to you all for days. The stories are amazing. One of I want to veer away from the questions in front of you. All of you talked a little bit about a notion of difference, being very aware that you were different from others because of, you sort of went to books, this idea of being a tomboy, James, becoming an athlete, Nataly embracing this aspect of yourself as woman. I'm wondering, you had a concept of yourself. Did you know other people around you who might have been experiencing difference themselves? I don't know if you call them lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, but were you aware of others, friends, family members in your circles as youth or as teenagers or as young adults who might have also been facing some of the same types of issues?
Yes, most definitely. We called them queers and fags in those days and sissies, and not queer in the queer theory sense of the word, that's for sure. I think it's probably a fairly common experience that just speak for myself, taught as I was to hate what I was, I not only hated it in myself, but hated it in others. So many times to deflect the attention from myself, I did to others what was done to me. I don't know if gayness runs in families, but I could say that my mother had 3 or 4 cousins, males, who appeared to be like me, one of whom babysat for me and was in the habit of wrapping himself in my mother's curtains and dancing through the house. And I didn't know if that was what I wanted to be, so I was sort of a little taken aback by that initially. And there were certainly others that I went to school with, even someone who is here today who was certainly the victim of the same kind of ridicule that I was. And some of those people are still my friends today. But yes, certainly they were visible, but not to be admired And I think we also kept our distance from each other because we knew that guilt by association would probably bring the same kind of discrimination and violence upon us as a group as for being individuals.
Thank you.
I grew up, I was born in Pittsburgh in the projects in what's called the Hill District. We moved to New York when I was about about 4. And at 5, we came back to my mother's hometown in northwestern Pennsylvania, which is what I consider my hometown. And I remember the first Christmas there. We were getting ready to open up presents, and my parents hadn't found a house yet, so we lived with my grandparents and my aunt and uncle in a 2-family house. It was a double house. My grandparents on one side, a maiden aunt who stayed, never married, who I had some questions about, but as I got older, but she never identified as being a lesbian. And my aunt and uncle on the other side, and we're all sitting around the Christmas tree, and this man comes in, and I'd never seen him before. And everybody's all excited, and people start crying, and they're embracing him. And as we started opening gifts, they gave him some gifts. And he started crying. And I couldn't figure out who this man was or why he was crying. I didn't know until probably 15 years later that Alton, who I grew up with, and who was, now I know, a queen, had just come back from a state psychiatric hospital. He was the only African-American man in a circle of men in my hometown. All the men were white, with the exception of him. They were Catholic priests and the sons of the doctors and lawyers in my hometown, and they got busted one night. And the white men said to the police, if you publicize this, you're going to be talking to my father's attorneys, or you're going to have to deal with the Catholic Church. Alton basically said, yeah, I'm a faggot, and what's wrong? And for that, he spent 2 or 3 years in a psychiatric hospital. I didn't fully appreciate what that meant until I was about 25. And so that was my first introduction to someone who identified differently. My recollection is that I didn't grow up with any friends who I thought liked girls or liked boys, because you have to understand, I'm 64. And when I grew up, that's something you didn't talk about. And it's not only that you didn't talk about it, but in the African American community, it wasn't anything that was even a possibility. So it wasn't even a matter of thinking about it, because black folk just didn't do that. It was something that white folk did, and definitely, if you were black, that didn't happen. So I found out again when I was about 15 or 16 that one of my first cousins was gay. And Alton had taken him under his arm and sort of mentored him through the very rough waters of my hometown in Pennsylvania. My cousin John died of AIDS now almost 30 years ago. But I remember him as someone who was extremely, extremely talented. Artistically, he was extremely bright. He was about probably 8 or 9 years older than me, and he graduated from Syracuse. And he was probably one of just a handful of African Americans who his generation graduated. John taught me as I got into my later teens that it was okay to be different. But again, I didn't name what that difference was. I just knew that there was something that just wasn't quite like, I wasn't quite like everybody else. And I watched the the battles, the quiet battles that John fought as an African-American man in a small town in Pennsylvania. When he escaped to go to Syracuse and he came back, he would come back and he'd be wearing lime green socks and yellow pants and, and a red blazer. And it was, again, as I got older, I realized that that was his not so subtle way of dealing with who he was and announcing to his family and to his community that he was a gay man. So interestingly enough, it was gay men who taught me to begin to be comfortable with who I was and not to apologize for that. And then just lastly, I remember when I met my partner at 25, and she came home with me to my home in Pennsylvania, and we'd gone back home a couple of times. And we're at my aunt and uncle's house, John's parents' house. We're at the table, because you did everything around the table and with food in my family, and we're getting ready to eat. My aunt had left the room. My cousin John was in New York. He wasn't back home. And my uncle looks at me and says, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, what do you mean, what's wrong with me? And he looked at Idell, my partner, and said, well, basically, why are you with her? There has to be something wrong with you. Now again, the words were never, the identification was not put there in terms of a label, but the behavior he was saying was not natural. And I remember when I get really angry, I come close to blacking out. And that feeling sort of came over me. And I turned, and I remember turning and looking at him and saying, "And you're the alternative." And just as that came out of my mouth, my aunt came into the room, and she must have seen the look on my face, and she must have said, my family's nickname for me is Margie, and they knew my temper. And so I know she's saying, oh, Margie's about to go off, and I need to, Bud was my uncle's name, I need to rescue Bud some kind of way. So she started shoving food at us as a way to just shut us up. And, you know, had she not come in the room, I probably would have continued to have some choice comments for my uncle, and I'm not quite sure how that would have played in my family, but my aunt was able to kind of just quiet the waters a bit, and after that, you know, it was my uncle and I just sort of kept a polite distance from each other.
Thank you. And by the way, your cousin John sounds like me. Yellow socks. And
Oh yeah.
Green pants,
yeah.
Yeah.
red blazer.
High top sneakers.
There was only one person that I knew in the community who I thought was a cousin, who was, as it's described in my community, funny. You know, it wasn't the gay or homosexual or anything like that. He was funny. And I don't know even today if that was true or not. But that was the only time. But I come from a very small, when you say small, I'm talking about 200 people, no traffic light. Now I'm talking about small. So you guys talk about small, you're talking about thousands of folks. And I'm saying 200 people, maybe, and that was in, when I was growing up in the, I'm 66, so from the time that I was able to do anything as far as learning what community is all about. That was the size of the community, and it's about the same size now. We still don't have a traffic light. We have progressed to some roads that are paved, so we're okay that way. But as far as it goes, when I moved to Newark, I moved with the purpose of doing what my sister had done. She worked as a domestic, and she was the first one in the family to graduate from college. She graduated from Shaw University by being a domestic here in Newark, with families. She would come to Newark with to live with my aunt and uncle, but she would work in the surrounding communities. for white families, and therefore she didn't have rent to pay or food and all that other stuff. And they'd also give her a stipend and clothing and stuff like that. So she would go back to Shaw, and she graduated. So I came to live with her with the purpose of working and going back to school. I graduated third in my class, so the idea was to go back home and go to a black college, although I really wanted to go to North Carolina, which at that time was an all-white institution. Instead, I started working, and I started sending money home to help my family. Then I got drafted into the military, and once I got drafted into the military, the house that my family was living in was so poor that I decided that I could use my stipend to buy my family a home. So I used my